The first season of Glow received 10 Emmy nominations, including for its cinematography. Adrian Peng Correia took over for the second season with the cinematography. Adrian, what are the visual rules for Glow?
Well, there are some specifics that followed from Christian Sprenger's work from the first season, which is naturally motivating most of the lighting. And there are some specifics in terms of coverage that are dictated by a show with that size of a cast. So when you have so much coverage and so many pieces to shoot involving specifics of timing and comedy, like you have to be able to shoot a large amount of coverage. Everybody gets singles, and something where we try to kind of coordinate between making sure we have the necessary amount of coverage to make the show cuttable and interesting, and still be able to use camera movement and creative staging and blocking to try and give us some dynamics on a show that is largely based around coverage because of the nature of the writing. So in terms of rules for it, it was more about when I spoke to Christian before the season started, because he had moved on to Atlanta season 2, was just trying to honor some of the elements of what he did, and in terms of naturally motivating, and a lot of the existing sets are already established, and trying to find a way to elevate the visuals for the second season, particularly because of there was going to be much more involved wrestling, and also the shift in storytelling in terms of this kind of collision between the worlds of these characters in real life and the personas they portray in the show. That to me was the most interesting thing about the second season, was that kind of handoff between the people they are versus the people they portray themselves to be in the show. So those kind of things kind of dictated some elements that we could play around with visually.
And when you say that you're elevating the visuals for season 2, what does that entail?
Well, I mean, it's like we had to find a way. Specifically, one of the things creators had asked for was um, a way to kind of create dynamics with the camera in terms of energy, to kind of give a more propulsive quality to some of the wrestling matches, because there is something lo-fi about the nature of the show itself, the actual show of Glow. You know, it's portrayed in a way it doesn't have a ton of production value. It's almost like it's a little show that could, so to speak. So it's based around like them trying to jerry rig and find a way to create a show that they're not sure how to make themselves. So in terms of creating energy that transfers to the audience, we played around with a lot of steady cam and just careful blocking, because we don't have a lot of time to shoot the show, based on not just the number of pages we have to do in terms of dialogue, but because the nature of shooting what essentially is an action sequence for every kind of wrestling match, and the inherent nature of the dangers of doing the wrestling, because for the most part, the women on the show are actually doing those moves, and it can be, you know, quite dangerous at times. So in terms of elevating, you have to find some way to make it dynamic and believable in terms of the space that the setting is in, the wrestling stuff, and then trying to find a way to make it still be believable in a way. It's an interesting fine line to walk between creating something that feels real and embodying the stylization that the nature of the show kind of demands. So.
Tell me about shooting the show within a show episode.
Yeah, it's amazing. That was one of my favorite episodes, and it was just something where you had to be very careful with the the work that was actually portrayed, because when we're talking about cameramen, like how good are the cameramen? You know, it's like, so you're doing the show within the show. Are they really skilled camera operators, or are they guys who are getting by? They don't have time to do tons of takes, so you can buy that they would do a shot and we would purposely have like bad operating, like tilts that would go too far, framing that didn't actually look terrific, that looks slightly off, or just like mistakes of focus. We would kind of embrace the elements of the messiness of what a production would be, so that the show doesn't have, like, you know, like sometimes when you're like shooting through the ropes and ropes are cutting off a face, everything's not really perfect. So it was an effort to really try to embrace that kind of messy nature of what the production would be, and then find some ways. There's like if you look at like the dance sequence with Sunita and Shakira, it's like the crane work isn't absolutely perfect. It's kind of they kind of go off the edges of frame, and then the camera's catching up. You would buy the fact that like these guys are trying to do something like a Stanley Donen-esque singing in the rain sequence, but they're just not good enough. So it was a fine line between trying to make those things be interesting and believable, but not perfect. You know, so messily perfect in a certain way. So that was a really, really fun thing to do, because you get to embrace the imperfections of what it means to make a show, as opposed to having everything be stone cold perfect every time, like you always do with production. So, and not to mention that you can let your kind of mind fly. And Mira, who directed the episode, had this wonderful calming influence where we'd be like, "Oh, we want to try this," and she would just be this calm blue water, where she'd be like, "Yes, let's try it." And then she would have specific ideas that she would pepper into the nature of this maelstrom that we were throwing together visually. And I think her being the rudder in that way kind of made that show a success. She did a wonderful job directing. I was really impressed with her. So.
I guess not really a cinematography thing, but I liked in the background of that episode when they were supposedly shooting on location, then there'd be people kind of pointing at the camera.
Yeah, exactly. It's like they're trying to get away. If you know, like if the scene where Allison is sitting at the burger stand, you get a sense that like the camera in the beginning is like a little bit far away, hidden near where like they'd be able to hide next to a car and those kind of things. And then obviously they have to get close-ups that read as close-ups, but there's something where like you're trying to find some stolen nature of what they would try and do to try to pick off pieces. It definitely looks ramshackle in a way that I think is really charming. So yeah, I love that episode. That was one of my favorites of the season. So
yeah, for Emmy consideration, you'll have to submit a 4-minute sequence from one of your episodes. Do you know which episode you submitted and which 4-minute segment?
that was extremely difficult, because it's like to find 4 minutes. There's like great like 2.5 minute sequences everywhere, but then you try to find 4 minutes that like that isn't a slave to coverage or has some real meaning to what the season is. And at the end of the day, I turned to the latter part of it in terms of trying to make something that kind of typified what the season was about. So it was the Mother of All Matches episode when Debbie and Tomei had their big match between Liberty Bell and Welfare Queen. And that episode was great because it kind of had this combination of like women on the verge of a nervous breakdown in a way, you know. So it's like they're both heading towards this kind of conflict on in the ring, but they also have these really definitive, almost kind of psychologically like destructive conflicts that are coming within the context of their lives, and which kind of culminates in the match. So there's the pieces chosen around the match, and the short time after the match when Tomei meets her son, and basically they talk about what he just witnessed in the ring, the fact that he feels how offensive it was, and then he kind of emotionally rescues his mother, who's does everything to sacrifice for him. And I would have loved to have been able to do the last bit with Debbie in the house with her baby, but it's impossible with 4 minutes. So, but yeah, that episode to me is really the crux of the season, you know. So I know everyone would think that like the spoiler alert, the thing that happens with Ruth, but I think Mother of All Matches is kind of the configuration of that idea of the people outside the ring and their personas inside, and how those things are conflicting with one another. So for me, that's the episode of the season for that.
What about, were you tempted by that show within the show, episode 8, or is that just kind of too experimental?
That was a worry about exactly that, about it being too experimental. I love that, but I'm hoping that the weight of the season will help carry all of it. And that's a tough thing too, because in terms of 4-minute sequences, because it's a show within the show, a lot of those sequences, because of the nature of what Glow is as a show, it feels a little bit too drawn out, a little too not, from a cinematography standpoint, it's not the most bang for your buck, even though over the course of the entire episode, it could be one of the stronger episodes. I also feel that way about like episode 9, you know, that Phil Abraham directed. That's a really great episode visually, between the convention center and and the dance and all that kind of stuff with Mark and his daughter. So it's like it's and Justine. So it's definitely a difficult thing to try and pull something just out of one element of the season. I found that fairly difficult.
You've said that Glow is the highest profile project that you've worked on. How did
Yeah.
they find you?
Um, this dictates. This is, I mean, it speaks so much about the industry in terms of just people knowing you. I have a friend named Reed Morano. Was an extremely successful cinematographer, and she obviously went on to become an extraordinarily successful director. And she happened to have a meeting with a person who was connected to Glow, and they had mentioned the fact that they needed a cinematographer. Reed spoke up and said, "You should look at Adrian." My reel got in the room, and I had an interview, and that's what happened. Tells you how kind of like, and I knew no one intimately with the production at all, like in terms of personal level or work with them before or anything. It was just the word of mouth of two particular people connecting, and then my reel finding its way into the room with Liz and Carly, and it worked. So that's basically how it happened. And then afterwards for American Princess, it was, I was already in, but it just tells you how thin and gossamer the path of your career can be and what it can hang on. So
Yeah, my best guess would have been that it was through kind of a Netflix connection since you did those House of Cards promo spots.
yeah, not at all. It's amazing. It's just that's a lot of what this industry is. It's just people are so um, you have a lot of risk in terms of like the show, any kind of show coming together. And if you know somebody who's worked with somebody who can stand up for them and speak for them and say this person is a good person, you should try them. That is the thing even more definitively than the reel or the work. People want to know if they're a good person to work with as well because they got to spend 5 months with me, 60 hours a week, 70 hours a week. That's got to be someone you can be able to be professionally work with and personally enjoy their company more than your family because you see them more than your family. So that's a big thing for how a career can translate. So
Which just came out. You did the first season of. Do you know if you're submitting work on that one for Emmy consideration as well?
I was told that they are. So I believe they are. So I hope so. That was a really great show. Rami is the exact opposite of Glow. There's no level of ostentation to the camera. It's about a character who's in stasis. So the camera reflects that element of his life. It's not a camera that propels him through life. It's a little bit more observational in that way, and it lets the person in this particular idea of this existential plight about who he is and who he wants to be, the camera more quietly observes, and that was the right element of storytelling for that. And the way we kind of tried to up the cinematic ante for that show was to have a look that was a little bit more specific in terms of stylization and not go totally naturalistic. We built a custom LUT around Fuji with cooler shadows and some yellows in the midtones and warmth in the highlights to kind of give it a specific color feel that didn't feel like strictly like reality because the camera was going to be a bit more reserved and the framing was going to be a little bit more um, naturalistic in some regards. And then we would experiment with more kind of specific framing with excessive headroom or putting people in closed framing and whatnot. So frames within frames and those kind of things. So it's kind of it's 180 degrees from what Glow is.
All right, and finally, I'll ask, why move on to that show instead of staying on for Glow season 3?
Well, I mean, like to me, I was already on American Princess, and I was I had been away from home from home in Connecticut for 15 out of the last 18 months. And, my wife called and was like, is there any way you can find something on this side of the coast? And you have to be able to you have to be able to make changes for the people in your life. So I was just like, called my agent. I was like, can we please try and find something on the East Coast? That pilot came to me, which is already shot by Ashley Connor. And I saw it and I was like, this is a really interesting story. This is about a community that is seen in very stark terms often in terms of content, unfortunately. And I thought it could be something like it could be like an All in the Family in a way. Try to have a more specific and American view of a Muslim family that can make the Muslims more accessible and seen in a light that makes them more human in many ways, because I think people have a perception of Muslims that is limited and distorted greatly by the news and by whatever sources of information they attain in life. And unfortunately, for the most part, Muslims are on the short end of that in terms of perception. So when I read those episodes and I talked to Rami and Christopher and Bridget, it would just seem like the kind of show that could have an impact socially, and that was really important to me. My camera operator, Claudio Rietti, we talked about that when I was talking about working on it. I was like, this show can be something that can actually have great movement in the culture. And then Claudio was like, yeah, let's do this. And that was it. Came home and it was great. It was a great experience. Plus, I started in New York, so it was a chance to come back and work with people that I hadn't worked with in a long time. And the vibe is different from LA and New York, so it was nice to come back to New York and experience that kind of like bitter frankness in a way, which I really kind of enjoy about the East Coast. So.
Great. All right. Well, thanks very much, Adrian. And to our viewers, you can stream both those shows now. And please also subscribe and go to Gold Derby to log your Emmy predictions.
Thank you.